Next comes Unix components. The three major Unix components are kernel, shell, and file system. Let's discuss about each one of these things. First comes kernel, and kernel is the very important part of operating system. It is actually considered as the heart of the operating system. Not only in Unix, in Windows, Mac OS X, in almost all the operating systems, there is a thing called kernel. So, what is this kernel is? You have to know that operating system is a collection of several programs. In that programs, some part of the OS has to run continuously in the system. So from the point of startup to shutdown, some part of the OS should be running continuously, which will allow us to use the system. Such part of the OS which runs continuously is called kernel. And when I said OS is acting as a mediator or interface between the user and the hardware, it is actually the kernel which is acting as the interface. Let's move on. And some of the responsibilities of kernel are these things. So it manages hardware devices, kernel provides process management, user management, and it maintains priorities per process. If you go through operating systems course, you will understand much better these things. Since those are out of scope in the subject, I am not going to go through them. And one more thing supported by kernel is inter-process communication management. So this one is very useful. Suppose you are running two processes on the system, they have to communicate with each other. Operating system must support this thing, inter-process communication. Let's move on. So this is the layered representation of the computer system. So we are outside users. You can have a user here, you can have a user here, and at the core we have the hardware layer. On top of hardware we have kernel, which communicates with any one of these things. So throughout the course we will be using something called shell, through which the user gives commands, and shell talks with kernel, and kernel talks with hardware. So let's move on. And something about shell. It is a program that lies in between the users and the kernel. Just now we have seen in the diagram, and it acts as an interface between the users and the kernel. So kernel is the interface between user and hardware, and shell is the interface between users and kernel. And through shell we give different commands. So it acts as a command interpreter or command processor, and it is mainly used to execute commands. Let's move on. There are different types of shells in Unix. Not only these things, nowadays there are more number of shells being developed. So these are the famous shells which can be used in Unix. Of course, some of these shells have different features which are not available in the others. The first shell that was developed when Unix was developed is Bourne shell, and the program name for Bourne shell is sh. And the bad thing about this is bash does not support background jobs. There is something called background process. We will not be able to run background process using Bourne shell. Next is C shell. So it is named like that because it is written using it shares the syntax of C language, developed by University College of Berkeley. And there is a free version of this C shell CSH which is called TCSH and is available in Linux. One thing to remember is Linux is derived from Unix. So most of the things supported by Unix will also be supported by Linux distributions. Next type of shell is Korn shell, and the program name is KSH. So it was developed at AT&T Bell Labs by David Korn, and It includes the features of both Bourne shell and C shell, and the free version of this Corn shell is public domain Corn shell, which comes by default with Linux. And nowadays the popular shell which is used is Bash, born again shell, and the program name is Bash. So this was developed by Free Software Foundation, and the others are B Fox and C Rami, and this is freeware. It's free to use. So these are various types of shells. Let's move on. And the third component of Unix is file system. So far we have looked at two of them. One is kernel, second one is shell, and the third one is file system. So what does the file system do is it controls how data is stored and retrieved. Also, as told previously, Unix treats everything as a file, and Unix follows inverted tree-like structure. So in Unix there is something called root node, which is denoted by slash, and under root node there are different folders or directories like bin. One more directory is etc. These are all predefined folders where different files are available. One is dev, which contains device files, and there are so many files like this. So if you look at this is like an inverted tree, right? So that is something about the file system. Let's move on. And something about using Unix. So if you look at here, first of all, to use the Unix OS, we have to get inside the Unix environment, and the process of getting into the Unix environment is called logging into the Unix system. So whenever you start the system, a background process which is also called daemon, and the process name is init, it gets loaded, and along with it starts some other background process, and one of those process is getty process, which will present the user with login screen, and the entire process is something like this. So if you look at here, whenever I switch the Unix system on, the init process is going to start, which spawns or forks out another init process, and that process is going to execute a process called getty, and this getty process is going to start login process, which will display username. So in Unix every user has a username and password. So this one will show username and password. If you give correct username and password, the login process will take us to shell, through which we can execute commands and so on. And after the entire thing is done, after our work is done, we will be logging out, right? And again, after logging out, we have to show another shell, and again this process continues, so on and so forth until the system is shut down. So this is a brief overview of using Unix.